Je me présente, mon nom est Jean Meunier, je suis le président du jury. Les membres du jury sont, comme examinateur externe,
s'il vous plaît,
le professeur Yann Leclerc. Nous avons aussi comme membre Roland Mimicevic. On a comme directeur et co-directeur Yoshua Benjou et Aaron Courville. Et représentant du doyen, le professeur Frédéric Gosselin qui est là, juste derrière. So we'll now switch to English for the presentation of Yann.
Hi, so the title of my thesis is Deep Learning of Representations and its Application to Computer Vision. I'd like to thank all the members of the jury for coming today to hear my defense. For everybody else, I'll try to make this talk as nice for you as possible, but I should warn you that the purpose of the defense is for the committee to evaluate what I've learned and contributed, and not necessarily to tell you exactly how to make all of this work for yourself. So throughout the talk, I'll refer you to other talks I've given that give a little bit more detail about some of these projects I've worked on, if any of you want to make use of them at home. The thesis presentation itself will be a little bit fragmented because I wrote a thesis by articles, which means that I stapled 4 articles together, and they're only very loosely related to each other. So I apologize for the diminished aesthetic appeal of that kind of presentation. As a basic overview, I'm going to give you a little bit of a summary on deep learning, which is the kind of machine learning that I studied for my PhD. And then I'll present 4 different articles that I wrote during the course of my time here. All of them are applied to solving computer vision problems. Other than that, they don't have a lot in common. The first 2 are about probabilistic models, Spikin Slab, Sparse Coding, and multi-prediction deep Boltzmann machines. The third article is about a new kind of activation function for neural networks called MaxOut. And the last article I'll present is about how we used convolutional networks to transcribe street numbers at Google during my internship there last year. So machine learning is defined as being the ability of software to learn from experience. Beyond that, it's difficult to define much more formally. There are several different approaches to machine learning that cause different systems to improve on different tasks with respect to different performance measures. And even the kinds of experience can be different. Today, I'm mostly going to talk about becoming more accurate at classifying input examples into categories, or more accurate at estimating probabilities of certain events occurring. And the experiences will all be things like getting to see an image or getting to see an image associated with a label. The basic principle that I use for most of the work that I'm presenting today is called maximum likelihood estimation. The idea is that you define a model that describes the probability of some event happening, such as an image occurring or an image having a specific label. And this model that defines its probability has parameters associated with it. If you change those parameters, it changes what probabilities the model assigns to different events. The idea behind maximum likelihood estimation is to pick the parameters that maximize the probability of the data in your data set being generated. There are other approaches to machine learning. Some of them work better when you have very few examples. Maximum likelihood estimation is an efficient and very reasonable way of going about doing machine learning when you have at least a couple thousand examples. The main technique that I use to perform this estimation in most of the projects that I present today is called gradient descent. The idea behind gradient descent is that you have some kind of objective function or cost function you want to minimize. Here I'm representing that with the function y equals x squared. And you can minimize this function by looking at the derivatives of the function at every point. So over here, the derivatives are positive, and you can move opposite the direction of the derivative to decrease the objective function value. So over here, as long as the derivatives of the objective are positive, we keep moving in the negative direction until we reach the minimum where the derivatives are 0. In multiple dimensions, the derivatives tell you which direction to move as well as the sign, but that's a little bit difficult to draw. Most of the projects I'll show you today involve supervised learning as some component. The idea of supervised learning is you have some kind of input, such as an image, like this photo of a bird, and you have some desired output, like a label saying that the image is of a bird. I'll use the variable x to refer to the inputs, and I'll use the variable y to refer to the targets. And in some cases where we might have more than one x, I might also use the variable v to refer to the input sometimes. But that should be clear from context. The main idea behind deep learning is that we often want to learn the way that we represent the data that we use. If you think about some standard machine learning classifiers like support vector machines, if you use a linear support vector machine and you try to classify this data set where all the x's are positive examples and all of the blue dots are negative examples, you can't pick any one line through this space that will divide all of the examples cleanly from each other. But if you change the representation to polar coordinates, then you can easily draw a single horizontal line that divides the two. This is just one example of how changing the representation can make a machine learning algorithm perform better. Obviously, there are more sophisticated machine learning algorithms, and there are more sophisticated reasons for changing your representation, other ways that things can become easier besides just introducing linear separability. But this is just illustrating the basic concept that the representation you use matters a lot for your performance. In deep learning, the specific idea is that we want to learn representations that are themselves composed of simple operations and other representations. By following several different simple transformations of the data, we can arrive at very complex transformations of the data. Here I've drawn an example using images from Matthew Zieler's paper on visualizing the features in convolutional networks. If you have an input photo, this consists of pixels, and it's very difficult for a classifier to associate values of individual pixels with category values associated with the image. You can't look at this tan pixel over here and say that this is a picture of a person. But what you can do is you can extract features at several different locations and have those features become slightly more abstract and have more meaning to them than the original pixels do. The first layer of your network, the visible layer, consists only of these raw pixel values. But the first hidden layer can extract features such as edges by looking for bright pixels, represented by the white lines here, next to dark pixels, represented by the black lines here. By pulling out all the edges across the image, we now have a representation of the image in terms of edges. And that makes it easier for the second layer to look for things like extended contours and corners. Finally, after we have a description of the image in terms of contours and corners, we can combine these descriptions into small object parts. And from description of the image in terms of object parts, it's easy to pull out descriptions of entire images, such as people or cars or animals. So that's the basic idea behind deep learning. The exact way that you learn these features and the exact way that they're extracted depends on the kind of algorithm that you use both for training and for inference. So you'll see several different ways of doing that today. The first paper that I'll tell you about is called Spikin, Slab, Sparse Coding. The full title of the paper varies a little bit depending on whether you're looking at the conference or the journal version of it. I wrote this paper along with Aaron and Joshua, who are here on my committee today. And the basic idea is that we wanted to make a new feature learning algorithm that we thought would generalize better when you have very few labeled examples available. And it does do that, but not quite as dramatically as we'd hoped. The main reason that we thought we might want to do this kind of approach is that another kind of sparse coding had been shown by Adam Coates to perform much better than RBMs. Even if you use the same features for both architectures, you could learn your features using an RBM and then put them into a sparse coding feature encoder and get better performance. At the same time, Aaron and another grad student here at Montreal had trained a model called the Spikin Slab restricted Boltzmann machine, which has a new kind of sparsity-inducing hidden unit in the model. Our idea was that maybe this new kind of unit from restricted Boltzmann machines could be useful if we introduced it to the world of sparse coding to get this improved generalization performance that the sparse coding feature encoder had shown on the CFAR10 dataset. The basic way that we need to train this algorithm is using what's called variational learning. This is necessary because some of the probabilistic computations that we need in order to maximize the likelihood of the data under this model are not tractable if you just evaluate the log probability itself. What we can do instead is we can construct a lower bound called the evidence lower bound, or the negative variational free energy, or the negative Helmholtz energy. The idea is that this green curve here, represented by the italic L, represents our lower bound on the true likelihood. And the true likelihood is a much nastier function. Both of these shapes here are fictional. They're kind of a cartoon idea of how you can think of this process in one dimensions. this isn't the real likelihood function or the real lower bound. But the idea is that by making this line wavy, we can think of it as something that's nasty to compute and difficult to work with. But by making this line smooth, we can convey that it's something easy to work with. The way that we actually construct this lower bound is by performing what's called variational inference. The specific thing that's difficult to compute in the Spikin Slab sparse coding model is the probability distribution over the hidden units given the visible units. And the way that we get around that problem is we introduce a simpler approximate probability distribution that we'll call Q. And we look for the Q that is as close as possible to the true posterior distribution over the hidden units. At the point where our Q matches the real probability distribution, the green curve would touch the red curve. In practice, we make assumptions that prevent it from touching. But we do try to make the bound as close as possible so that we're working in as close a space as possible to the original learning problem. The way that we actually carry out this search for the best Q is by minimizing the KL divergence between Q and the true probability distribution. Doing this requires both analytical and iterative optimization. What I mean by that is we can use the Euler-Lagrange equations to solve for what kind of function you need to represent the probability distribution. But that function is still going to have some parameters on it. And those parameters need to be found by an iterative search. That iterative search can often be very expensive. So what we approached in this paper was a better way of doing that iterative search. To explain exactly how it works, I'll need to tell you a little bit more about the model itself. The Spikin Slab sparse coding model involves variables that we call H, which are binary. We call those the spike variables. And also variables called S, which are real valued. We call those the slab variables. Every spike variable is paired with a slab variable, and they're multiplied together before you do a linear transformation to get a reconstruction of the observed data V. The basic idea is that you can think of this as decomposing an image into a set of edges. Each spike variable is saying that each edge can be either absent or present, and each slab variable is saying how strong that edge is in the image. In other words, a brightness associated with that component. When we want to do inference over this model, the Euler-Lagrange equations can tell us that we get a Gaussian distribution over the slab variables, and that our spike variables are basically just parameters that we need to find with an iterative optimization procedure. Unfortunately, no one else before us had been able to scale this model to a very large size. This is a plot in log space showing the number of training patches on the x-axis and the number of latent variables in the model on the y-axis. And different approaches to this problem had all gotten stuck along this diagonal line in log space, where as you try to scale up to larger and larger sizes, you just get stuck. To do good work in object recognition, you have to get up here. These blue dots are previous work in object recognition using other kinds of cheaper feature extractors. The little green plus signs are where we got to with our new inference algorithm. So our new inference algorithm was based on moving to the graphics card and designing an update that allowed us to update all of the parameters of the variational distribution in parallel, rather than updating each of them iteratively. Updating them iteratively didn't work as well with massively parallel architectures like GPUs, and so it was forced to run at relatively slow speed on CPU and not benefit as much from updating variables simultaneously to resolve conflicts faster. Finally, we did get the payoff that we were looking for. We did actually get better generalization when few labeled training examples are available for each class. So here we took the CFAR 10 data set, and on the x-axis, we used different amounts of labels. All the features were learned on the entire data set. And this figure originally came from a paper by Adam Coates, where he compared a code that he calls thresholding to sparse coding. They're the red and the blue curve with the confidence intervals around them. To this figure, we added the Spikin Slab sparse coding curve. So we can see that on this curve, where there aren't very many labeled examples available, we outperform sparse coding every step of the way. We believe this is because the spike variables allow the Spikin Slab sparse coding model to have true sparsity. It can say that certain edges are not present in most of the samples that it generates. Traditional sparse coding uses what's called a Laplace prior. And if you generate from the model, it almost never generates anything that actually has a true 0 in the code. So the higher amount of zeros might regularize the model more strongly in some way. We don't have an extensive explanation of why this actually works better though. When we go to the full-size data sets, we didn't actually manage to beat the state of the art with this model. We did manage to improve the state of the art with a fixed pooling pattern. So features are extracted all across the image, and then you take little grids of them across the image and take the average of the feature value within each grid. Using that, we were able to perform better than Sparse Coding, which was the previous state of the art. There was a new adaptive pooling method that we weren't really able to reproduce in our own work, and that adaptive pooling method, working with a different feature extractor, had the state of the art on CFAR 100 at the time that we wrote this paper. If we used a pyramid method to try to compete with it, we could get the error bars on our accuracy level to overlap with their error bars. But overall, Spikin Slab Sparse Coding didn't really push forward the state of the art a whole lot. It just allowed us to work better when there are very few labeled examples available. One thing we did do that was pretty exciting was we won a transfer learning challenge at NIPS 2011. We had a very small labeled training set. This is the entire labeled training set. The idea was you could train the model on the entirety of CFAR 100, and then for these new classes like tomatoes and ants and things like that, you got only these examples. We used Spikin Slab Sparse Coding and the grid pooling pattern to win the contest with a test set accuracy of 48%, even though we had as few as 5 examples for some of the classes. The next paper that I'll present is called Multiprediction Deep Boltzmann Machines. This one, there's a video available online as well as the paper. The video is associated with the International Conference on Learning Representations 2013 in the workshop track. And that might be a little bit hard to dig up because the final paper was actually in NIPS. The basic idea behind this paper was that we wanted to find a better way of training deep Boltzmann machines. Deep Boltzmann machines are a probabilistic model that we find very exciting because they have feedback connections. But the way that you train them is very complicated and hacky. And we think that partly it's just frustrating to deal with that level of complication, and also we think that it introduces some suboptimalities because the procedure is too greedy. This paper was with my co-advisors Aaron and Joshua, and also Mehdi Mirsad, who couldn't be here today because he's in California for an internship. The typical DBM training algorithm that we want to improve consists of 4 stages if you have 2 hidden layers. And it grows linearly if you have more hidden layers than that. The first stage is you do, you train a restricted Boltzmann machine, which is like a little building block of these deep probabilistic models. And it has just a single layer of hidden variables. You train this one model to represent the input data well. And then you train as many other Boltzmann machines on top of that as you need to build the whole architecture that you want. After you've finished training each of the individual models, you glue them together into one big, deep probabilistic model, where maybe the first layer represents edges and the second layer represents corners and so on. The cool thing about this model is that the knowledge of the corners can influence the knowledge of the edges. The information doesn't flow purely uphill, it flows both uphill and downhill. After you've glued this model together, you can jointly train the whole model to maximize the log probability of both the pixels you see coming in from below and the labels you see coming in from above. So you're learning both to associate pixels to labels. You can learn that pictures of cats are cats, but you're also learning how to draw new cats. After you've done this training stage here, you can go ahead and convert this into a specialized classifier by taking the weights that you learned in this generative model and using them to define a feed-forward multi-layer perceptron classifier. At the same time, you also delete the class variable from the old model, and you freeze all of the weights in the original model and continue learning. Deleting this class variable doesn't correspond to marginalizing it out. It's just a hack that the original authors found worked very well. So we have a few issues with this training procedure. One is just that it's complicated. It has some crazy hacks in it, like deleting this variable here. But the other is that we think that training each of the layers in isolation is too greedy and deprives them of the opportunity to cooperate with each other and learn from the start that corners can influence edges and so on. We think that one reason that the layer-wise pre-training is necessary for the deep Boltzmann machine to work is that we train the deep Boltzmann machine using these sampling-based approximations. The idea is that the deep Boltzmann machine's probability distribution is defined using two different factors. One is the one that has all of your parameters in it, defining relatively how likely each state is compared to the other states. But then to get this to be a probability distribution, we need to divide by the partition function. It's just a normalization constant that makes your entire distribution add up to 1. The problem is that this is often intractable, and in deep Boltzmann machines it is. The way that we can approximate it is if you look at the derivative of its logarithm to maximize the log likelihood, you end up being able to write it in terms of an expectation over different states of the gradient of the energy in that state. And you can simulate this expectation by drawing samples from the model. Unfortunately, drawing samples from the model requires Monte Carlo, Markov chain Monte Carlo. And that has issues with mixing between widely separated modes and a few other problems. One thing in particular is you don't know how many steps of Markov chain updates you need to do before your latest sample represents a fair sample from the model's distribution. So if you take too few steps, your gradient will be inaccurate when you train using the persistent contrastive divergence algorithm. And that's pretty much the only algorithm that worked for deep Boltzmann machines prior to this paper. We think that one reason that deep Boltzmann machines might be so hard to train all at once rather than layer by layer is that the number of steps that you need to mix well between gradient steps changes a lot during the course of learning. If very early on the second layer doesn't do much of anything, then you can make pretty big steps on its parameters without damaging your Markov chain. But then as it starts to specialize and actually be useful, you can get multiplicative interactions where small changes in the deeper layers modulate the lower layers as well and get essentially use that leverage to really change the distribution as a whole. And what your mapping between parameter space changes and KL divergence space changes might be very different as learning proceeds. So our goal was to make a new learning algorithm where we can throw out all of those problems. Instead of training several different models with several different steps, several different criteria, we'd like to just train one unified probabilistic model from the start and be able to classify well with it, evaluate probabilities well with it, and so on. The way that we did this is with what we call multi-prediction training. We use variational inference to infer the probability distribution over subsets of the variables given other variables. So here each row corresponds to the learning step on a different example in a mini batch. And we would run all 3 rows at the same time to get a better estimate of the gradient of this criterion. The black circles represent variables that we observe. The blue circles represent the targets of the variables that we want the model to fill in. So we observe these black variables, we run mean field inference through an architecture that looks kind of like a recurrent network. And at the end, we get the model's estimate of these blue variables. Then we use backpropagation to improve the log likelihood of the model's estimate of those variables. This turns out to be similar to a criterion called generalized pseudo-likelihood, but we're making a variational approximation to it. One thing that's worth noting is that the kind of variational approximation we're making here is a little bit less principled than the one we used for Spikin Slab Sparse Coding. Here we don't actually get a lower bound on the generalized log pseudo-likelihood. The partition function makes that very hard to do. But what we can say is that we're finding the closest to the true distribution possible within the model, and then we're shaping that approximate distribution. There's a few different benefits of this training procedure. One is that the learning rate doesn't really affect how accurate your approximation is. The inaccuracy in your approximation comes from the variational assumptions that you make, like that the different units are independent from each other. But it doesn't matter what your previous steps of learning did. PCD, you have this persistent chain that sticks around, and if you break that chain by moving too fast, then your approximation will suffer on the subsequent steps. Another thing is that as you continue to learn, because the inference defines the entirety of learning, your learning algorithm will start to make the independence assumptions more and more true as time goes on. With deep Boltzmann machines trained with PCD, you partially get that effect because you have the mean field inference in the positive phase, but the negative phase might undo it to some extent. So the models we learn might be somewhat suboptimal, but they also have a better idea of how to do inference in themselves. I should also mention that similar ideas have also been applied by Stoyanov et al. In 2011 for other kinds of models that weren't as deep, weren't Boltzmann machines. There's also a trick that we can do to reduce the cost of mean field inference, which is you just reduce the number of steps and you divide the input by 2, and you treat everything as observed. This is a trick for inferring the labels given the inputs, and the math behind it is not really sound, but it's following the same trick that inference in the dropout algorithm uses, and it seems to work well in practice. Over here you can see that we actually get better accuracy with the multi-inference than with true mean field inference. And that comes from the fact that if you do multi-inference, you're averaging together several different recurrent nets that all solve similar optimization problems. So if there are small imperfections in the way that they've been fit, you can wash those imperfections out. Our results are mostly on the MNIST data set. The original DBM got 95 mistakes on the test set. If we use the same setup as they did, we get 99 mistakes. So this is where you have the extra MLP on top of the deep Boltzmann machine. If we just use inference in the model itself and we allow ourselves to make the model a bit bigger than they did, we can get down to 91 mistakes. And that's like an average over 5 folds or something like that. If you run it multiple times, you'll get it down to mistakes in the 70s sometimes, but that's not a reliable outcome. We also looked at the variation across different hyperparameters. These box and whisker plots are showing you the error in log space on the y-axis of a few different methods. The other methods are centering-based training of deep Boltzmann machines, which is another way of training deep Boltzmann machines without having to do layer-wise pre-training. The people that introduced centered deep Boltzmann machines didn't write much about classification, so we ran the classification experiments to see how well centering works for classification, and it doesn't seem to work very well for that task. In particular, multi-prediction deep Boltzmann machines reach a much lower error rate, and they are also a lot more robust to choices of hyperparameters. Centering does work a lot better for the log likelihood of the pixel values, though. We don't really understand exactly why centering fails for classification, but multi-prediction fails for sampling. Overall, we accomplished the goals that we wanted to. We got one model that can be trained with one criterion, and that uses the same unified probabilistic model both for filling in missing values and for classification. So the next paper I'll show you was a collaboration with like half the lab. And this is called MaxOut Networks. For people that want to see more detail, there is a talk about this at ICML 2013, and the videos from that are online, as well as the paper. The basic idea behind MaxOut is we wanted to introduce a new kind of activation function for neural networks. The way that neural networks usually work for feed-forward networks is you have some sort of input vector that we'll call V. You have a bunch of weights that are defined by a big weight matrix. You can do a matrix multiplication to go from V to Z. Usually you also add some biases in here, but I didn't draw that. So each row of the matrix that defines one of your Z output values is called a weight vector. And each of the individual Z values is fed through an activation function to output the final value of your hidden layer. And this activation function is usually element-wise, meaning we apply the same function to Z1 to get H1 as we apply to Z2 to get H2. But we don't ever look at more than one Z value at a time. One of the most traditional functions is the logistic sigmoid activation function. The idea is that on the x-axis we've got the Z value coming in, on the y-axis we've got the H value coming out. And when Z is very negative, the output is close to 0. When Z is very positive, the output is close to 1. That makes it easy to interpret this value as saying whether some feature is absent or present. When we use things like gradient descent, it's very easy to make fast progress going downhill if you land on the steep part of this curve. But if you land over here, you don't make any progress. So a new hidden unit that was introduced by Jarrett et al. In 2009, and then popularized by Xavier-Leroux in 2011, is the rectified linear activation function, where it doesn't saturate on the right. It just goes up in a straight line forever. On the left side, it's flat. And you can make a lot better progress on this kind of gradient than on the gradient of the logistic sigmoid activation function. However, you can still get stuck left of 0. So one way of dealing with that is to actually make a new kind of activation function that looks at 2 different z values at the same time. And specifically, our activation function is just to take the max of those values. Other people have previously done things where they take the max over groups of different values, but they tended to have some other kind of nonlinearity in between the z and the max. So the idea behind this project is to see how well you can do using only the max itself, because that lets you essentially learn the activation function. So here we've learned to do the absolute value rectification function, which is a popular activation function, especially in the first layer of convolutional networks for vision. The difference is that rather than being driven by a single input z value, we've got 2 input z values. So our x-axis is now assuming we have like a single v input value that drives the z's. If we land over here where the green line is maximal, then we can update the parameters for the green line. If we land over here where the blue line is maximal, then we can update the parameters for the blue line. There's nowhere you can land that you get stuck. So learning can proceed much faster in this kind of architecture. If we compare MaxOut to various sizes of rectifiers, it's a little bit tricky to make the comparison fair because there's different numbers of parameters and different numbers of units. This blue network here represents the MaxOut network. We've got 2 different filters per layer, or per unit, sorry. One thing we could do is we could compare to a rectified linear network that has exactly the same architecture, but it does the comparison against 0 to get the rectified linear functionality. And this has the same number of parameters, the same number of units, and so on. But it's kind of unusual because you don't usually do cross-channel pooling in a rectifier net. So that might be unfair to rectifiers. To make it more fair, we tried 2 other versions of rectifiers. One where we have the same number of outputs per layer, but that has fewer parameters in the MaxOut net. There's another one where we do the same number of filters per layer, so it has more outputs. And this has a lot more parameters overall than the MaxOut net. So it's a bit unfair to MaxOut, but we wanted to make sure we gave rectifiers a fair chance. So we instantiated all 4 of these different architectures. We did a random hyperparameter search over all of them, and then we plotted the best example of each of them on the CFAR10 dataset. You can see that MaxOut is the dark blue curve, and if you add the 0 to the max so that your inputs are rectified linear units rather than just the linear response, you do quite a bit worse. If you make it smaller and get rid of the zeros, you do even worse. If you make it really big, which makes it more expensive to train than the MaxOut net, it actually keeps up with the MaxOut net for quite a while, but then it gets stuck after a while. So it seems like MaxOut is a way of getting a lot of filters into the network very efficiently, and also allowing the gradient to flow through very fast. There's a few other advantages to MaxOut that I won't get into detail about here. It also works very well with the dropout algorithm, but due to limited time, I'm not going to present that part in detail. MaxOut has been applied for several different problems since we first published it. It's been especially popular in the speech community, which is surprising because we use it exclusively for vision, but there have been at least 4 speech papers that I'm aware of using MaxOut. One of Yoshua's students also used it to do matchmaking for multiplayer games. It's been used by Andrew Zisserman's lab for text detection, which means just finding where text is in a photograph. It's been used at McGill for text transcription, which means actually reading the letters out of the text after you've seen it. And in Yoshua's lab, it's been used for making optimization problems easier by converting neural nets to MaxOut when you wanted the optimization to not be as difficult. It's also been used in recurrent networks here. And then in some online challenges, it's been used for whale call detection and black box classification. Black box classification means you're given data and you're not told what the data means at all, but you're asked to classify based on what the pattern in the training set was. So the last paper I'll show you is about my internship at Google last year. This was with the Street Smart team at Google. And it's about how to transcribe the address numbers on buildings seen by the Street View car. The basic idea is we have sequences of numbers coming in. So this is a little bit different from the object recognition work I showed earlier, where you have a bird and you want to say it's a bird. Here we've got multiple numbers, and we want to say what category they're in, but we also want to get those categories listed in the right order. So that's a bit trickier. The other thing is we don't have very good detection of them. So earlier I showed you that really nicely cropped picture of a bird where the bird filled the whole image. Here we don't know exactly how big the numbers are going to be or exactly where in the image they're going to be. So we want a single neural network that can find the numbers and transcribe them to the output. The way that we did this is with a convolutional network where we assumed that there is a bound on the number of output digits that we're going to use. So we said that there's going to be at most 5 digits. We have one output that encodes the length from 1 to 5, and it can optionally also say, that's longer than 5, I don't know how to transcribe it. And that means that we could then have a human being transcribe that one. For Street View, that's acceptable because it means we can save a lot of money on hiring human operators. We can now hire them only to transcribe the street numbers that are of length 6 or greater. If you wanted to make a robot that autonomously drives around and finds houses based on their address number, then you would need to have some way of handling longer sequences, but we stepped around that problem for this application. Each of the different digit classifiers responds to just a single position in the sequence. So this one tells you what the first number is, this one tells you what the second number is, this one tells you what the third number is, and so on. All of these different classifiers are fully connected to a set of features that are extracted by a convolutional network. And we train the entire thing with backprop. And that means that if it wants to spend most of the effort learning features that help it predict the length, it'll do that. If it wants to devote most of the features to the first digit, it'll do that instead. We don't need to spend a lot of time hand designing most of the system. The way that we train this is we just write down a log likelihood for the sequence as a whole. The way that the log likelihood looks is you evaluate the log likelihood of the length, and then you sum over the true length in the data set, the first L positions that have been labeled. So at train time, you don't need to rely on the model's estimate of the length to figure out how long the sequence is. You can just use the label in the data set. And you simply don't backpropagate anything for the digits that aren't used. So here, there's only the first 3 digits being used. At test time, we actually do need to figure out the length, and that is just slightly complicated. You can't just ask the length predictor how long it is, because that will disregard the probabilities of the sequence of a whole. It will look at only the individual element. But if you want to look at the log probability of the whole sequence, you need to scan through each of the individual digit predictors and see how much probability they assign to their maximal class. So if you have a 10-digit classifier that's really not confident, it will assign like probability 0.1 to everything. And that might be a sign that you shouldn't try to output a digit in that position. Because you've got to commit to a bet on a single sequence. So if your length predictor is only slightly less confident that your sequence is length 4 than length 5, the digit predictor might push it over the edge. It turns out that you don't really have to do this if all you care about is making a map. When we make a map, we throw out the lowest confidence predictions anyway, and just have human operators transcribe those. If you care about evaluating the total accuracy across the entire data set, then you actually do gain a few percentage points of accuracy by doing this optimization. But the only things where it's changing their answer are the ones that we have low confidence anyway. So they're the ones that are usually thrown out in the commercial system. On the public Street View house numbers data set, we set the state of the art both on the individual characters and on the full sequence. But nobody else had published on the full sequence before. We also had an internal private data set that's much harder with things like numbers that are spray painted on the wall in countries that can't afford full plastic mass-produced house numbers. And so on that data set, we only get 91% accuracy. Human accuracy is about let's see, I actually don't have it on this slide. I think we actually matched human accuracy on the public SPHN. Oh, sorry, our coverage at human accuracy is 89%. So we can transcribe 89% of the data with the same accuracy as a human. And the system knows when it's going to be inaccurate, so we can throw out the remaining examples where our accuracy would drop below the human rate. Here are some examples of numbers that we transcribed. This is specifically ones that we got wrong, to give you an idea of how hard the internal private data set is. Here we transcribed this as 1180. This 7 could look like a 1 in isolation, but as a human being, when you see it in context with the other one, you realize that they probably did not change font in the middle of the address number, so you can infer that it must be a 7. Our system isn't smart enough to have figured out the law of conservation of fonts. Over here, this is one that the human operator actually got wrong as well. I actually can't read it. You can see that a number fell down, and because the box is less dirty where the number was, you can tell what the number used to be. I think it's a 3, but that's from memory. On the projector, I can't actually read it. Our human operator transcribed it as 184 and just ignored the gap. And our convolutional net guessed that the answer was 1844 and got it right. One thing that can also confuse it is large gaps between numbers. So here, the correct answer is 239. Our text detector was actually a little bit high, and we cropped the 9 off. But the convolutional net didn't even get the 3, because this gap between the 2 and the 3 was big enough that it decided that they were separate pieces of text. Finally, our interface for working with this system is not really the greatest, because sometimes we're asking the convolutional net to do magic. If we show it a large square with several numbers in it, it's pretty hard for it to know it was meant to transcribe the 676 down here, and that this 500 up here is part of an add. One thing we found that was pretty cool is that this network gets smarter and better at this task with depth. One thing that kind of guided our development of this system is something that Jan said on Google+, actually, which was someone was asking, why is it interesting to study architectures with depth greater than 1? And Jan said, because it's interesting to study programs that can execute more than one sequential instruction. So you can think of each layer as executing instructions in parallel, but when you have more layers, you can execute instructions in sequence. And this is a little bit of a different perspective than the representation learning perspective we use in the other work. This one is saying some of our features might not be factors of variation that are driving the data. Some of them might just be little bits of bookkeeping that the program is using while it proceeds through the segmentation algorithm. And so we have both factors of variation and little index variables that help us to parse better and better as the network gets deeper and deeper. As a control experiment, we tried running networks with more and more parameters that didn't get deeper, and they just overfit. So that seems to suggest that depth is a nice prior, which is one of Yoshua's perspectives, that a lot of why depth is helpful is that we're telling the system that the function it should use ought to look like several recursively applied functions, and not just something that can be done massively in parallel early at the start. As a broad conclusion to the thesis, I would say that the last 4 years have been very exciting and have been a time of a lot of change in deep learning. When I signed up, everything was all about unsupervised learning. And we did indeed confirm that unsupervised learning can help you when there's very little labeled data available. But unsupervised learning is not yet to the point where we can really solve AI-level tasks with it. And it could get there someday. It could get there someday, especially in combination with other techniques. But it's not there right now. Another thing we found is that some of the work that we developed in the course of working on unsupervised learning is actually useful in the short term, even if it doesn't lead to better classification. It is very good for things like filling in missing values, like the MPDBM is able to do, or being able to classify in the presence of missing inputs. And finally, we found that there is actually a very effective way of getting deep, large neural networks to perform very well on human-level AI tasks. And that is to use lots of implicit ensembling as provided by the dropout algorithm and also sort of by the multi-prediction algorithm. And also to just use a whole lot of data like we had for the Street View project. And this suggests that over the next 5 years, hopefully we'll learn how to do well without needing so much data. And we'll be able to leverage the unsupervised learning techniques that have somewhat fallen out of fashion but haven't yet fully reached their potential yet. And that concludes my presentation, so I'm ready for questions.